and I'm going to introduce Aria Allen. Aria is a senior at UNC Chapel Hill, and she's majoring in journalism with a French minor. She aspires to work as an international journalist, specializing in bilingual reporting between the US and Francophone countries. Last summer, with grant support from UNC School of Journalism Media, she traveled to Bourdeaux, France, to produce a podcast capturing the city's atmosphere before, during, and after the Olympics. Today, she presents her thesis on the role of bilingual journalism in strengthening French-American relationship. You're welcome to start.
So hello, everybody. Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. I feel so accomplished after hearing that. So thank you so much. And as was introduced today, I'll be presenting my senior honors thesis, Streets of Bourdeaux. And a big part of this thesis was discussing the role of portraiture as an art form of journalism, and also discussing my role as a portraitist and the biases that could have potentially brought to this work. So I thought I would start with a quick introduction to give a little bit of background about my worldview. I'm a senior here at UNC Chapel Hill. I came to the school after taking a gap year from my previous university, in which I lived and worked abroad in France. And that was an incredible opportunity for me to develop more of a cultural awareness when it came to French culture and French language. I also come from an immigrant family, and I think combined that really helped shape my worldview as to emphasizing the importance of having an intersectional and international approach to discussing different issues. So here is the thesis in one slide. Just kidding, we'll get to it more later. But the thesis essentially has two parts, one of which is Streets of Bourdeaux, the podcast, and the other of which took more of a traditional thesis form of Streets of Bourdeaux, the written thesis, which is an exploration of the podcast as a form of sonic portraiture and audio journalism. For this project, I was lucky enough to receive grant funding, which took me to Bourdeaux, France for the summer. It was an incredible summer to be in France. For those of you who are staying up to date about French politics, there was a lot of political instability going on there, which meant it was a really great time to be a journalist in France. So I essentially spent the summer roaming the streets, interviewing different people, attending protests, dodging gas bombs when applicable, and that resulted in the creation of this project. So I'll briefly touch on the written thesis, but for the focus of this presentation, I think it's more engaging to focus on the podcast, which is really the heartbeat of this project. So for the written thesis, this really discusses, as I said earlier, audio journalism as a form of sonic portraiture, and also discusses the importance of journalists acknowledging their own role in the creation of work, specifically podcasts that are bilingual. So in this written thesis, I trace the roots of portraiture as an art form. We look at more traditional forms of portraiture like visual portraiture, as with the example of Madame X by John Singer Sargent. And then I move to more contemporary forms of American sonic portraiture, like portraits produced by StoryCorps. And I also looked at forms of French portraiture that I thought did a great job capturing the intimacy of lived experiences. And that's where Elodie Font's Coming In was a really great example of this. And in short, that essentially discusses her experience as an older queer woman coming into her sexuality as a lesbian, and she uses the art form of sonic design and merges that with her more journalistic background to create this wonderful soundscape of her experience coming into herself as a queer woman. And for me, acknowledging all of these different forms of portraiture, be they visual or be they sonic forms of portraiture, was integral to the creation of this project, which took on a role of sonic portraiture. And understanding my own limitations as a sonic portraitist in creating this project, especially when I, as a journalist, had to balance my own preconceived notions of France as an American, the moments in which my lived experience might intersect with that of my interviewees, and also leaving a lot of space, the majority of the space, I would like to think, for the acknowledgement and the exploration of a country with a different culture, a different socio-political climate as well. So, kicking things off with the podcast. The podcast was a really fun experience. Yes, as with anybody who's presenting a thesis today, I definitely cried. I definitely had some temper tantrums. I definitely had a few meltdowns. I think it was just as difficult to create as it was rewarding. And the core of this project was trying to replicate my lived experience as a bilingual journalist in Bourdeaux to help transport my listeners into the soundscape of the city that I was in all summer. So to do that, I really started playing around with sound design and sonic forms of cultural immersion. And in doing so, I tried to find this balance between including French actualities or sound bites of people speaking and balancing that with um, different ambient sound I captured at different events to just have the sound of the event with my own narration and reporting as a journalist to provide a guide and kind of a socio-political and economic context for the listener to understand the relevance and importance of this moment to French history. So with the first episode, the election, this was captured during the political instability during les élections législatives and la dissolution de l'Assemblée nationale this summer. The heart of this episode focuses on protesting as a movement against the rise of fascism in France. While I was at these protests, talking to people, interviewing different people, that was really the heartbeat of that movement. And that's really the heartbeat I wanted the listener to hear. So in this first episode, I ended up creating this soundscape that included the sound of the protest itself, the gas bombs exploding, the fences being torn down, the smashed windows, the smashed ATMs, people protesting in the streets, but also balancing that with the more intimate portrait of why this moment was so important to marginalized communities. And in my time as a journalist there, I really had the chance of meeting friends of a friend, and their names are Oriane and Janice, who are pictured, see if this will circle, right here on the slide, who are a queer POC couple who ended up being attacked by a group of fascists the night before the first round of voting. And I heard about their story. I had reached out to them to see if they would be interested in sitting down and talking to me and sharing their lived experience with Americans here in the US who are the primary demographic of listener for this podcast, so they can understand why it's so important to have this anti-fascist movement in France right now. And to also understand that just because the extreme right, le RN, didn't win and French voters formed Un Front Républicain against them doesn't mean that the threat of fascism is over. So in sitting down with Oriane and Janice, this is a moment in which I acknowledge my role as a portraiture in the written thesis, is that I brought Mousy, who I'll circle. He's my little stuffy ESA, is what I like to call him. And I brought him with me because I knew this would be a difficult moment for Oriane and Janice to discuss. I mean, you're reliving trauma with this random American journalist sitting in your apartment. I just felt so grateful to be let into this intimate space that I wanted to show some of my gratitude by helping my interviewees be as comfortable as possible. So I brought Mousy with me, and Janice adored him, and she ended up playing with him for the entire interview. And at the end of the interview, I asked if I could just record her playing with him, just the sounds of the mouse shifting around in her hands. She said yes, so I did. And that ended up forming part of the soundscape for the portrait of their interview within the episode itself. So if you go back and listen to that episode, when you hear the sounds of the beans shifting, which are introduced, that sound of Janice playing with him ends up emphasizing different moments of the story being told. So going back to my role as a portraitist, that's where it was more heavy-handed here than in other places. And with their story, it was recounted in French, and a lot of my listeners did not speak French. So for me as a journalist, and also having the American ear, it was really up to me with their interview, with other moments in this podcast, to discern the moments that had enough sonic texture and that were emotive enough to include, that listeners could have a feeling from, even if they didn't understand the words being spoken. And also try and find the cognates that were obviously close enough to English to where the listener just understood what was being said, but wanting to try and balance the two of those things with the narration and with the sound design to try and create as immersive of an experience as possible without overwhelming whoever was listening to the episode. So in this way, each portrait within Streets of Bourdeaux is a sub-portrait of a different event that happened in the city each summer. And the narration will go more into depth of why it was so crucial to the socio-political or socio-economic movement at hand. And for Another aspect of this project was really figuring out how to leverage social media as a form of journalism, because in the digital age, there's a movement in which journalists are becoming more so journalist influencers than just staying traditional journalists. And to help try that with this project, I started exploring audiograms, which is essentially when you put a picture and you have some kind of dynamic graphic with a part of the podcast clip to that moment. So I'll play one of those now.
Française, ouais, oui, je suis française.
He is française, a granddaughter of with grandparents from Vietnam and Newfoundland.
Même si des fois on a envie plutôt de pleurer finalement parce que
Her eyes tear up, imagining her family, imagining what Ellen's reinterpretation of
Liberté, égalité, fraternité.
shaking cigarettes and chewed lips agree
les choses sont en train de basculer ici et c'est quand même pas grave.
that either the nouveau Front Populaire wins on July 7th or fascism seizes control.
Et c'est très grave ce qui se passe.
So that was the first audiogram I created, and I also wanted to play with more traditional forms of journalist influencer mode, so I created another Instagram reel. I love when I can use social media in my professional life, but I created an Instagram reel of a few highlights that I had captured throughout the protest, which I'll play now. And one more thing I'll mention, I think you saw a little heart pop up that says "Suis pas une poucave," and it means I'm not a snitch. And that's what I added to the reels when I thought somebody's face was too directly in the camera and they ran the risk of their identity being exposed. As being in these protests, there was a climate of fear there, and a lot of people did not necessarily feel comfortable going on record with their thoughts on the political instability in France. So that was a balance I found in which I knew I couldn't have a person's explicit consent in creating these reels, as it would have been impossible to track everybody down. But I would have rather blurred somebody's face out in a kind of creative, cheeky way, one could say, rather than run the risk of this popping up on somebody's For You page and someone losing their job, being reprimanded at work, or some kind of grave consequence coming from being in a reel. I talked a lot about the first episode, and now I'm not going to talk in this room. I'm just going to go ahead and play a part of the second episode in which the narration and the sound design will speak for itself.
The nettoyage social has been less extreme in Bourdeaux,
Comme à Paris,
but
la gentrification qui a beaucoup
the city
Bourdeaux 2030
is an urban planning project to make Bourdeaux more sustainable and attract new residents. Public green spaces promote sustainable leisure, and the new bridge connects La Rive Gauche and La Rive Droite for the 100,000 anticipated new residents.
pas besoin d'attendre d'être pauvre pour être sensible et empathique avec les gens qui n'ont pas d'argent.
The flowers tattooed on Miriam's arms.
Donc, c'est pas forcément les pauvres qui luttent pour eux-mêmes.
Bourdeaux's cost of living grows with its population.
C'est le fait de remplacer les populations pauvres des centres-villes.
Home prices in targeted zones could increase up to 20% by
Et
2030.
les pauvres, petit à petit, sont obligés de partir.
For her
Moi, je suis pauvre, hein, concrètement.
and others who receive income-based social
Je
services
suis au RSA,
or live below the poverty line,
qui vivent en dessous du seuil de pauvreté.
Bourdeaux 2030 gentrifies the city's unaffordability.
On ne fait que déplacer le problème. Hein.
The swirls on her next letter as she waves her Palestinian flag for the déplacés outside and inside of her city.
Okay, So with this second episode, the heart of this episode is looking at the Olympics as a means of recruiting foreign investment. France currently has a national debt that consumes about 114% of its GDP, and reducing its budget deficits is integral to the country's financial stability. However, with the political instability previously discussed in the first episode, the government has been unable to pass the economic reform needed to fully address these problems. And typically, when there's a lack of government intervention, there is an opportunity for privatized investors to capitalize off of that space. And when I was researching France 2030, which is essentially a national strategy to relaunch France on the global stage as a social, political, and economic superpower, I ended up discovering that a lot of the cities that were satellite cities for the Olympics, like Bourdeaux, Lille, and a few others, also have 2030 plans. So we see this flow of tourism and thus this flow of foreign interest from Paris to smaller cities dispersed throughout France that are being presented as cultural hubs, which thus encourages a flow of foreign investment as well to smaller cities that have a lower cost of relocation for companies interested in investing here. But when I was diving deeper into these issues, something that I just could not get out of my head was, okay, this is essential to France relaunching itself on the global stage. This is essential to France's financial stability. But with this influx of foreign investment, who is going to be displaced from this? And it just so happened that during the Olympics, I'd gone to a protest. I was really interested in going there more so at the time to talk to people about why it was important to keep protesting during the Olympics. And while I was there, I ran into Miriam, who is pictured right here, who you actually just heard from in that clip of the podcast I just played. And something that really struck me about her interview was talking about the increase in gentrification in Bourdeaux and how that was affecting her. Miriam identifies as low income, she receives social services, and she's already been struggling with the city's rising cost of living. And just for record, while I was researching, I also found that in certain zones that were targeted zones for foreign investment, we would see increases of up to 20% for the cost of living for residents in those affected areas. And I thought that was really powerful and important to capture as part of this conversation. As to me, as a portraitist, when I was forming a portrait of different aspects of the city and thus different aspects of France at the time, I also wanted to form portraits and anecdotes of people who were being affected by these larger issues, so Americans understand what is truly at stake on more so of an individual level than just a larger socio-political or socioeconomic level as well. And here I also included just a few other pictures of interviewees and moments captured throughout the event. If you listen to the episode, it's anchored in scenes of me at the Olympics, and I go much more into detail about direct foreign investment, the increases France has seen since the Olympics, etc. But for the focus of this presentation, I wanted to more so focus on the anecdotal, more portraiture-like aspect of each episode. So that was my second episode, the Olympics. And for those of you who are interested in following my journey as an independent journalist or listening to the podcast in its totality, or even reading the written thesis, which hats off to you if any of you go out of your way to read that. I'm quite proud of it, but that would be an honor and a compliment in the highest honor if you do read it. I included a few QR codes in which you can do so. So thank you so much. It was really wonderful to present here today.